Hello to our Word on Fire Institute family and to all of you joining us on YouTube. I'm Joshua Bidding, Assistant Director of the Word on Fire Institute. Welcome to Evangelization and Culture, our live seminar on a topic at the crossroads of faith and culture. We're delighted to have with us in the studio today, Dr. Sofia Carozza. Dr. Carozza is a researcher whose work integrates neuroscience, clinical medicine, and philosophical inquiry. She is currently pursuing a medical degree at the University of Chicago, inspired by patient encounters during her time as a postdoctoral researcher at Harvard Medical School. Her doctoral work, completed at the University of Cambridge as a Marshall Scholar, used computational modeling to explore the neurodevelopmental effects of early life adversity. Her current focus is on the role of social relationships in brain health. More broadly, her work engages philosophy of science, philosophical anthropology, and the dialogue between science and religion. Sofia completed undergraduate studies in neuroscience and theology at the University of Notre Dame, where she graduated as valedictorian of the class of 2019. In 2023, Pope Francis appointed her a member of the Pontifical Academy for Life. She is also co-host of the Pilgrim Soul podcast. Dr. Carozza will give a two-part presentation, Evangelizing a Fractured Culture, Insights from Neuroscience and Theology. Today's lecture is entitled The Brain and the Person, Approaching Neuroscience as an Evangelist. We are dual streaming today's presentation on the Institute platform and on YouTube. For those of you viewing from the Institute platform, please open up the chat icon below the screen and introduce yourself, who you are and where you're joining us from. And as we begin, please start typing in your questions and comments, which we'll be getting to in the second half of today's presentation. To those of you watching on YouTube, please also be encouraged to do the same. We want to invite everyone watching on YouTube to consider joining the Word on Fire Institute. But without further ado, let's get to Dr. Sofia Carozza on the brain and the person. Class is in session.
Thank you, Joshua, for that kind introduction. I'm delighted all of you are here with us today for a discussion of neuroscience and theology and how integrating these disciplines can help us evangelize a fractured culture. Francis Crick, the co-discoverer of the DNA double helix, once wrote, "You, your joys and your sorrows, your memories and your ambitions, your sense of personal identity and free will are in fact no more than the behavior of a vast assembly of neurons and their associated molecules." While Crick deliberately phrased this claim in a provocative manner, he was far from alone in his belief that everything about human life can be reduced to deterministic interactions between matter. The typical narrative of scientific progress in the 20th century is one of a materialism triumphant. It is that neuroscience has extended our mechanistic explanations of the physical world into the person herself, explaining human subjectivity by recourse to physics. This perspective has successfully penetrated the public imagination, helped along by the many academics and entrepreneurs who use neuroscience to make a dizzying range of claims. Just walk into any bookstore today and head over to the psychology or neuroscience section, where you will find titles from politics to cooking to spirituality that try to use brain science to reveal the truth of some human reality. These voices often carry a considerable amount of weight in our society, including among those looking for a definitive, satisfying answer to the ultimate questions of the human heart. And they're driving people away from the faith. For the logical conclusion of reductionism, that is, the idea that Crick espoused, the idea that everything is ultimately matter, is that we have no need for anything but science. God is dead, neuroscience reigns, And anyone who remains a Christian is merely buying into an antiquated myth. The idea that the scientific perspective is in conflict with the Christian one has devastating consequences. Indeed, when young Americans who have left the Catholic Church are surveyed about the reasons for their departure, more than 1 in 3 endorse the idea that the church conflicts with my scientific beliefs. That's even more than cite a loss of belief in God, or that say that the church wasn't meeting their spiritual needs. The church conflicts with my scientific beliefs. The tragedy of this situation is deepened by the fact that it completely misses the mark on neuroscience. In the popular imagination, the world of academic neuroscience is typically pictured as a collection of cold departments where laboratory after laboratory seeks to uncover neural mechanisms that can explain away things like freedom, love, belief in God, or any other higher reality we might hold dear. But in my experience, this is quite far from the truth. Neuroscience is a discipline not only compatible with personal acceptance of the transcendent dimensions of human life, but indeed a potential springboard for developing awareness of them. In other words, few neuroscientists may in the end agree with Francis Crick. In my years working in research in neuroscience, most of my colleagues were far more likely to be sympathetic to non-reductionistic perspectives and curious about my religious beliefs. Rigorous sociological scholarship upholds this to be true. Across the world, scientists are more likely to be religious than we think, and most see little to no conflict between science and religion. Furthermore, scientific research is a deeply personal act that originates in wonder, is animated by love of the truth, and leads to praise. Thus, for many scientists, science feeds faith. Indeed, far from leading me away from Christianity, my own studies of the brain continually bore out the truth that reality is one, and that our discoveries about the natural world can only complement and enrich what we know through faith. What would change in American society if this were widely known? Imagine how many of our brothers and sisters would be spared the needless suffering and confusion of feeling torn between a scientific worldview and a Christian one. Imagine how many could be liberated from the discovery of the unity of life, the unity of the person, the unity of truth. And all it would take is a correction of some misunderstandings. So that is the aim of today's seminar, to explore the true harmony between neuroscience and the Catholic vision of the human person. We'll start by tracing the origin of the false narrative that neuroscience threatens Christian faith. In other words, how did we get to our current predicament? We will then hit the reset button by learning what neuroscience really is, a form of reasoning about creation that reveals great beauty and can put flesh and bones on our understanding of human nature. This is a topic that will deepen in tomorrow's seminar on the neuroscience of human relationship. To conclude today's seminar, we will examine some ways that neuroscience could bear fruit for our personal lives of faith and for our mission as baptized Christians to evangelize a secular culture. So let's start with a little history. If neuroscience is in fact eminently compatible with Christian faith, why isn't it seen this way? Why instead is it invoked on so many attacks on the church and her beliefs? The full answer to that question would start thousands of years ago with a story about a man and a woman eating an apple. But because our time together is limited, I will pick up the threads in the mid-20th century. It was something of a golden age for the natural sciences. James Watson and Francis Crick, whom I mentioned at the start, built on the work of Rosalind Franklin to discover the double helical structure of DNA in 1953. In this discovery, the physical mechanism of heredity, the chemical storage format for the biological information we receive from our parents, was revealed. It was beheld on X-ray crystallography. And biologists were enraptured, thinking we had surely found the master key that would unlock the mystery of human life, and indeed reveal it to be no mystery at all. The confidence of these biologists was fueled by the move of many physicists in the early years after World War II into the life scientists. As biophysicists, as they were called, brought their hard science mentality with them into biology, encouraging a generation of scientists to apply mathematical methods to biological problems and launching the modern field of molecular biology. Early successes in the study of things like viruses encouraged the view that with enough information and time, we could eventually predict anything about life, including human life. Around this time, the movement of cybernetics was born, the study of the control of complex systems. Theories developed by leaders like Norbert Wiener and Claude Shannon laid the foundation for the development of computers and eventually artificial intelligence. Even at their incipient stage in the 1950s, these ideas were powerful and influenced biologists to view living organisms as self-regulating machines. This is when the prevailing metaphor for the human brain became the computational one. It was hardwired, a kind of biological machine. In a short span of years then, different branches of science had come together, uniting their tools to explore the physical processes that support human life. This joining of disciplines gave birth to the extraordinary confidence that scientific progress would one day find the truth of thought and behavior in the brain. It was a bold hope, but one that seemed to find confirmation in the early discoveries of neuroscientists. At this time, pioneering neuroscientists already knew that the brain was modular, or in other words, that it has different parts and different systems devoted to different tasks. Neuroscientists had discovered this through studying stroke survivors. A stroke to one part of the left frontotemporal lobe, for example, consistently causes an inability to speak, while damage to a region further back impairs the ability to understand language. As the years went by, these scientists found more and more functions that depend upon particular regions of the brain. This put any dualistic conception of the human person, a conception, in other words, that considers soul and body to be separate substances, on very shaky ground. Why should damage to the brain affect capacities of the soul if the two are completely separate? Even more dramatic evidence against such a separation came from scientists who manipulated the activity of individual brain regions. In other words, they changed directly the firing of neurons. Neurosurgeon Wilder Penfield, for instance, performed brain surgeries on patients with severe epilepsy while they were awake. In order to determine which areas of the brain he could damage and which he should instead avoid damaging, he would stimulate the cortex with electrodes, inducing activity with an electrical current. And Penfield found that when he stimulated a strip of tissue at the top of the brain, patients would feel or move a different part of the body. Each body part corresponded to a different section of tissue in this strip of the brain. Even more strikingly, when Penfield stimulated the temporal lobes on the side of the brain, patients reported vivid flashbacks of past experiences, like rehearing a fragment of a childhood lullaby or reliving a conversation with a now deceased loved one. The thinkers of the mid-20th century interpreted these results from neuroscience and others as evidence for the deterministic and materialistic view of the human person. In other words, that the brain is just a biological device that controls the body and records memories into its physical hardware. That the mind just is the functioning of this biological device. And therefore, it follows that if one had exhaustive knowledge of every physical process, everything going on in the brain, one could adequately predict and even control every conscious experience, from memory to love to, yes, belief in God. Note that this was not a scientific discovery. It was a philosophical interpretation of scientific evidence, a conceptual way of tying together advances that had been made across fields. This is a very important distinction, because data do not speak for themselves. They do not reveal truth except through the subjectivity of a scientist. Scientists who are susceptible to the influence of ideology, scientists who can be wrong. But this distinction was lost on the general public. Through intellectual sleights of hand, these philosophical interpretations of brain data were presented as the simple truth, emerging from the bare data of neuroscience research. There was no other explanation offered except that the brain was a computing machine. And as a result, the deterministic narrative of the brain took hold in the public consciousness, where it remains ingrained to this day. And you and I are not unaffected. Even if we profess a different view of the human person, even if we would never explicitly state that we are simply biological machines, this view lurks in the background of our own consciousness. It is the air we breathe and the water we swim in as Westerners. We excuse our quirks of personality by saying we're just wired that way, or may even describe depression as simply a chemical imbalance. We're sympathetic even to the idea that artificial neural networks are mimicking human cognition, having no problems with this reduction of human thought and consciousness to information processing. Of course, then, the new atheists continually invoke studies of the brain in their arguments against religion. Of course, young people email me in droves asking how it's possible to be a Christian and a brain scientist, or more seriously, asking me how to fight against the nihilism that has suddenly gripped them upon reading a book about the brain. My argument today is that need not be the case. This state of affairs is the fruit of a contingent historical development in philosophy. It is not inevitable, for it is not the truth of neuroscience. It contains a kernel of truth mixed in with ideology. My proposal is that if we understand neuroscience properly, it would instead serve the Christian mission. It would both build up our own faith as Catholics and help us evangelize our culture. So let's start over. To hit the reset button on how neuroscience is used in our culture, we must ask a fundamental question. What is neuroscience? Formally, neuroscience is defined as the study of the structure and function of the human brain and its relationship to human thought and behavior. Let's repeat that. Neuroscience is the study of the structure, so neurons and brain regions, and function, the communication between them, of the human nervous system and its relationship to human thought and behavior, what you and I do all day long. Implicit in this definition is that neuroscience is not a self-contained discipline. It rests upon a prior definition, a prior understanding of the human person. To understand what neuroscience is, then, we must contextualize it in an adequate philosophical anthropology. Let's do that together now by breaking neuroscience down, systematically examining its object, its subject, and its method, the object, subject, and method of neuroscience. Let's start with the object. The object of neuroscience is the human brain, which is arguably the most complex and beautiful organ in the human body. The brain bursts into an existence in the first days after conception, while a child is still a tiny embryo in his or her mother's womb. A handful of cells start to become neurons or brain cells, which will proliferate rapidly over the coming weeks and months and reach 86 billion in number by birth. The emergence of the human brain is a miracle of organization that we will discuss in more detail tomorrow. For today, it's enough to say that in the mid-20th century, which, as we've seen, was the golden age of scientific materialism, neuroscientists thought that brain development was entirely driven by genetics. In other words, they thought that information from our DNA wholly and inflexibly directed the formation of the brain. Since then, evidence has piled up against this belief. Now, genes do significantly contribute to laying down the early scaffold of brain structure, but also from very early on, these genes are in dialogue with the environment, and eventually the environment takes over the directive role. The environment. In other words, a child's active and free engagement with reality, her sensory experiences of the outside world, drive patterns of activity in her neurons that shape which brain structures form, how they communicate with one another, and thus which thoughts and behaviors her nervous system can eventually support. As an example, let's consider language. A child learns language through listening to her parents and caregivers, through receiving their spoken language in the context of their loving care for her. As she begins to try to imitate the sounds that they make and associate those sounds with meaning, for the milk that she thirsts for, the nap she perhaps doesn't want to take, her brain begins to form a language network. This is a set of regions, typically in the left hemisphere, that works to support this child's understanding of language and, in concert with her muscles, production of language. Her native language, the language she has experienced. An Italian child, for instance, will have networks that permit her to trill her R's in a way that an American child simply couldn't. The magnitude of the impact that early experience has on the brain diminishes across the lifespan. This is one reason that bilingualism in childhood is such a gift. Or, more seriously, why being raised in the faith as a child is such a gift. Because our early experience builds a neural foundation for the rest of our lifetime. But fortunately, the ability of the brain to change is never lost. When we repeatedly use neural connections, they grow stronger. In part, this is mediated by a process where supportive cells called glia wrap their fatty membranes around neurons to accelerate their communication with one another. Now, our supportive cells, our glia, target those neural pathways that we use repeatedly. In other words, the more we use a neural network, the stronger it gets. So our free choices and our habitual actions literally shape our biological architecture, forming neural pathways that support our choice of those actions in the future. By repeatedly choosing the good, therefore, like being kind toward others, we actively make our brains and bodies into those of a kind person. So in a sense, the brain is an object that participates in its own determination, or perhaps to put it better, the brain necessarily points to a human agent who is a collaborator in her own continuing creation. This is one reason that we have great difficulty in neuroscience making predictions about people, something that often surprises non-neuroscientists. Because according to the determinist narrative where we started, someone's brain structure and function should very strongly correlate with what they go on to do and to become. For instance, wouldn't you think that brain structure should go on to give us a prediction of later mental illness, or attentional skills, or IQ, or empathy? But on the contrary, our strongest correlations are quite weak, far less strong than trying to make such predictions based on personality, say. And furthermore, this doesn't just hold when we're looking years in advance. Even now, our best measures of your brain structure and function are unlikely to tell us very much about anything about your mental health, your intelligence, or your habits. This is not, of course, to say that the brain is not important to these aspects of the human person. It very much is. But it's only one part of the picture, one element of a complex and hierarchical organism that is irreducible to the brain. What does that mean? What else does the brain need? Well, to start, for the brain as an organ to carry out its role in these functions, for it to play its part in supporting our thought and behavior, it must be embedded in a broader context of embodiment. For instance, the brain engages in a continual, bidirectional dialogue with the enteric nervous system, the large group of brain cells found in your gut. This second brain in the digestive tract contains 100 million neurons that communicate with the central nervous system to integrate our metabolic state with our most basic emotional experiences. Research indicates, for example, that our sensation of disgust is dependent upon hormonal signaling and muscle contraction in our small intestine. This active role of the rest of the body is not limited to emotion, which is perhaps more intuitively grasped as a fundamentally embodied human experience. On the contrary, many of our cognitive abilities, our thinking, is intimately interrelated with our body schema, or the processes that register where we are in our posture in space. For example, persons conceptualize time with reference to their bodies, associating the past with behind them and the future with before them. Similarly, a person's ability to mentally rotate an object depends on the very same signaling processes as does physically rotating an object. The human brain belongs in the body. It is one element of an embodied whole. This situatedness of the brain in the rest of the body is one reason for a phenomenon that philosophers call multiple realizability. Multiple realizability is the remarkable fact that the same mental function, whether it is the process of problem solving or the act of recalling a memory, The same function can be supported by vastly different neural configurations. We see this across persons. So in other words, you and I are likely to have very different activation patterns when we perform the exact same task, perhaps even very different activation patterns. But we also see multiple realizability within persons across time. So in other words, if I scan your brain twice and ask you to do the exact same thing, the neural correlates would change. Most of our findings in neuroscience are based on averages, on taking the mean across time and across people, a fact that tends to be missed by the general public. Why does this matter? Well, multiple realizability means that the same meaning or the same capacity can be realized through different matter. The implication is that matter alone cannot be the final explanation. It suggests that we need recourse to a higher dimension of reality, the level of abstract concepts, the level of the mind, the level of the whole person, to explain lower operations of nerves. This is a devastating point against strict materialism. It reveals that the person is not a closed circuit of biological processes, but a reality that both transcends and somehow organizes the very biological substrate that supports it. So let's look back across these preliminary thoughts on the brain as the object of neuroscience. When we speak of the brain as our object of study, of what are we speaking? We do not speak of an organic machine that deterministically produces our thoughts and behaviors. Instead, we're speaking of a collection of tissues that's inextricable from the rest of the body, that is brought into being through experience in an environment, and that enables us to participate in our own creation and development through acting in the body. When we speak of the brain, then, we speak of an organism that is an organ that is unique to each person, and that can only be explained in light of the person as a whole. Evidently, far from supporting an atheistic, nihilistic view of the world, this vision of the brain is eminently and perhaps even preferentially compatible with the Catholic view of the person as free, embodied, responsible, relational. So that's the object of neuroscience, the human brain. Let's now move on to the subject, the scientist. These truths about the human brain that I've just enumerated do not spontaneously emerge from a vacuum. As Michael Polanyi explained in his masterful work, Personal Knowledge, knowledge only emerges through the perspective of a scientist, and to eliminate this perspective could only lead to absurdity. Science is not a view from nowhere, or a cold mechanical process of data collection. Neuroscience as a discipline is the activity of a human subject, the scientist. It's a deeply personal act. The scientist uses her reason not as a detached instrument of logic, but as a dynamic relationship with her object of study, as the expression of her heart's insatiable need to understand the truth of things. Reason, therefore, demands her total engagement with reality. A few implications reveal the harmony between the work of the neuroscientist and a Christian worldview. First, our work is animated by awe. If you ask any given neuroscientist why he or she chose that career, more often than not, you will hear a story of wonder. The human person is moved to inquire after truth when something in reality arouses her mind and heart, whether it is the delicate star-like beauty of astroglial cells or the enigma of an infant's developing behavior. Awe lies at the origin of our work. And empirical research confirms that awareness of the transcendent, this experience of wonder, is uniquely associated with creativity and accuracy in scientific thinking. If a neuroscientist follows this awe rather than subordinating it to productivity or the accomplishment in her career, her work becomes a continual occasion to receive creation as a gift and as a mystery, and to behold it with reverence. So first is awe. Secondly, the work of a scientist inevitably draws upon a prior understanding of human realities, as we've touched on. From the very beginning, as she plans how to turn her questions into experiments, she's applying and interpreting concepts such as health, reason, emotion, morality, concepts that do not emerge spontaneously from biological facts. Neuroscience is overtly reliant, therefore, on definitions and considerations that have been proposed by other fields: psychology, sociology, anthropology, philosophy, theology. Implicitly or explicitly, the scientist will have evaluated these other definitions from these fields in light of her own experience and designed her studies according to these judgments. The use of such prior judgments is not just bias, or rather, perhaps it's an inevitable form of bias that we simply need to make explicit and for which we need to provide reasons. It's when you don't do this that neuroscience becomes dangerous, because we can operationalize concepts badly. For example, take studies of free will. Your understanding of free will shapes how you, as a neuroscientist, design your study and interpret the results. Most studies that claim to be studies of free will use the very simple paradigm of a researcher asking his or her participants to flex their finger whenever the urge strikes them. These researchers then try to find predictive patterns of brain activity that happen before the participants report the decision to flex their finger. But as I and others have argued, this is not a study of free will at all. Free will is a deliberate, higher order process that unfolds through time and takes planning. These are simply studies of the urge to perform a motor action, something more akin to suppressing a cough. Their results, therefore, cannot disprove the existence of free will. Neuroscientists are thus not autonomous investigators, independent of the shackles of other disciplines, but deeply dependent upon their social situation, their education, the intellectual and cultural context that surrounds them. And whether or not our studies reveal anything true or interesting about persons turns on this dependence, on our adoption of adequate definitions of what we study. So second is this dependence. Finally, the work of a scientist is the work of conversion. Neuroscience continually demands a love of truth greater than the attachment to one's prior ideas. Some of the greatest discoveries in neuroscience, such as the neuron doctrine, that the nervous system was made of discrete cells and not just one continual network, demanded that many established scientists change their minds about the fundamental nature of their object of study. Pride, stubborn, and ideological attachment to our existing ideas tend to put up a fight. Scientists must be animated by love of the truth to be wholly open to what is before them. This realism is what allows us to see the thing itself rather than a mere projection of our prior ideas and our theories. So if a neuroscientist is faithful to this call, her work thus becomes a continual occasion for conversion and for humility. This description of neuroscience as a discipline shows it, again, to be very far from the materialist account of the field. It is not an objective view from nowhere. Neuroscience is instead the free act of an inquiring subject who, animated by wonder, informed by other traditions of inquiry, sustained by love of the truth, seeks to understand the biological dimension of irreducibly human realities. That is the subject of neuroscience, which brings us now finally to the method of neuroscience. What method does the scientist use to satisfy this insatiable curiosity about human realities, to answer her questions? The method is the insistent observation of reality using the tools of neuroscience, which are experimentation, neuroimaging, modulation of brain activity, computational analyses. Note that these tools are quite limited. Indeed, if we were to analyze neuroscience according to Aristotle's account of causation, we could say that neuroscientific explanations can offer material causes. In other words, that they can identify that out of which a thing is composed. For example, neuroscience can tell us that your visual processing of me on the screen is composed of neural activity in the visual pathway from the retina to the cortex. So too could neuroscience specify an efficient cause, or the agent that causes the operation to take place. In this case, we could say it's the perception of a visual stimulus. Neuroscience might even posit a final cause, or what the operation is for, by drawing on evolutionary biology. Our ancestors may have needed sight and vision in order to avoid predators or to find food. But neuroscience cannot determine formal causation or why some For that, neuroscience depends, as I mentioned above, on collaboration with other disciplines. Neuroscientists, even very serious and competent scientists, often miss this. They claim to give a full explanation of the phenomenon they're interested in, when in reality, they've just avoided having to invoke a formal cause by reducing it to a lower level of the brain. For example, they avoid having to say what fear is, what the essence of fear is, by describing it as just the activity of the amygdala. This is called the mereological fallacy. It's the ascription of some capacity of the whole person, to a part of the person. It's a fallacy to ascribe fear to the amygdala, just as it's a fallacy to ascribe the experience of God to a neural network. These are experiences of the whole person that take up these parts. Now, neuroscience is quite powerful when it is applied within this limited domain, when applied to the study of material causes. Neuroscience has revealed the molecular processes of countless diseases like ALS, the biological arrangement of our sensory systems, the neural structures essential for our interactions with one another. Neuroscience has this power because reality itself is intelligible. There is an objective reality outside of us with which our intellect can make contact, a reality that is not chaotic and random, but profoundly ordered, structured in a way that our minds can grasp. Historically, this view of reality grew out of and was nurtured by Christian faith. Early pioneers of Western science saw and understood the intelligibility of reality to be a reflection of the infinite reason of its creator, the Word of God. As the author Bruce Marshall wrote in one of my favorite novels, the miracle of rule and regulation is every bit as much a miracle as the miracle of the suspension of rule and regulation. Rule and regulation of reality are a miracle. Reality, including its material aspect, is given. And the method of neuroscience is personal attention to this physical reality as a gift from God. Hopefully by this point, we have now corrected some of the misconceptions about neuroscience that pervade the popular imagination. We have a better sense of what neuroscience is, its object, its subject, its method. But why should we care? What are the potential implications of this view? I would like to propose that when we get neuroscience right, when we correctly conceive of its object, the brain, correctly apply its method, the field offers a splendid illumination of the truth of who we are as human persons. First of all, the findings of neuroscience support a vision of the human person as a mysterious unity of body and soul. The theorists of the mid-20th century were right that the dualism of the past is no longer tenable, the view in which the mind was a ghost in the machine, animating the body. But neither is their own materialism a viable possibility, because insistent observation of the person clearly points to realities irreducible to matter, like freedom, relationship, and desire. Rather than dualism or materialism, then, modern neuroscience is most consistent with a view of the human person as an integral whole, in which transcendent realities are intertwined with and organize our embodied existence. Neuroscience is most consistent, in other words, with a hylomorphic view of the human person, in which the soul is the form of the body. Because the soul is the organizing principle of the body, our scientific discoveries about the body can deepen our self-knowledge and help our striving, in the words of Pope St. John Paul the Great, to become who we are. Consider, for instance, the domain of habit and virtue. When we study the process of neuroplasticity, or the brain's ability to change, we discover that the biological substrate that undergirds our conversion in the spiritual life is in the brain. We see that our repeated choices literally reform our matter, disposing us either toward virtue or toward vice. This fact lends great importance to the small choices that we make every day. The offering of our work to God, the smile that we give a stranger, the choice to practice patience when struck in traffic. Awareness of our neuroplasticity can also transform our view of asceticism. It can help us realize that spiritual disciplines upheld by the church, like fasting or prayer, are not arbitrary rules, but practices rooted in the non-dualistic certainty that the discipline of the body is essential for the purification of the soul. Finally, I think understanding of the dynamics of neuroplasticity can make us more compassionate and patient toward those enslaved by habitual sin, and more profoundly grateful for the gratuitous mercy communicated to us in confession. In the domain of habit and virtue, therefore, neuroscience can bear great fruit, the fruit of appreciating the reality and importance of our free participation in the ongoing act of our own creation. Or consider the domain of prayer. The findings of neuroscience about the networks and pathways active during prayer and mystical experience can illuminate some ways in which God communicates with us. It's a level of explanation that complements rather than competes with the level of the Spirit. For instance, greater knowledge of the neural mechanisms of attention versus rumination or distraction can help us cultivate inner silence and stillness, a state that we know by faith is not only an absence, but the manifestation of the presence of God. Given the popularity of mindfulness and other attempts at meditation, it's clear that our contemporaries are hungering for experiences of contemplation. Here, knowledge of neuroscience, I would suggest, can help the church bear fruit in richer and more vibrant prayer lives for ourselves and for others. Or consider the potential fruit of integrating neuroscience with Catholic social teaching. Often in post-Enlightenment modernity, the measure of a person is reduced to his or her cognitive performance. We assess personhood by the capacity for self-consciousness and the continuity of memory. This Lockean view of identity from John Locke suggests that personal value is something we achieve through our own mental abilities. The logical conclusion of that is that when these capacities of the mind fail or never developed in the first place, there is no person to be spoken of. There is no source of dignity. To see the devastating consequences of this view, it's enough to look at the state of end-of-life care in many Western nations. Neuroscience here reminds us of the importance of the body and of relationship in the functioning of any human person at any stage of life, not only when we have cognitive impairment. We are continually dependent upon one another, inescapably dependent on loving relationship. Tomorrow, we will speak in more detail about the biological evidence of this fact. Far from upholding the view of the mind as an autonomous and disembodied entity, neuroscience thus reminds us that we are creatures brought into life and sustained by what Alistair McIntyre called networks of uncalculated giving and gracious receiving. So these scientific findings can help us move past the tyranny of performance and focus instead on cultivating the virtues of dependency essential to the common good. This task of converting our gaze, our perspective, is essential if we are to protect the dignity of children, of the elderly, and of those with disabilities in particular. But stepping back from these practical tasks in which neuroscience can assist us, let's consider the fruits of neuroscience for our self-awareness as beloved sons and daughters of God. Here, the study of the brain is a profound way to witness our creatureliness. Looking upon the staggering complexity of the 86 billion neurons and 100 trillion connections within a single human head, one is struck by a magnificent complexity that no human engineering has produced, an infinitely comprehensible beauty that reflects the image of the Creator who loves us into being. And pondering the mysterious unity of that brain with the rest of our person, one is struck by the mystery of God's plan, his thoughts that are so much higher than our own. And the still greater mystery is that the Word of God himself took on this flesh, this nature. He had a brain like ours. Neuroscience is a testament thus to the shocking humility of God, who humbled himself to share in all things but sin. He took on a nervous system that needed the loving care of his parents in order to grow. As Scripture says, he grew in grace and wisdom in the home of Joseph and Mary. He, like every human child, vulnerably relied upon the care of his parents to form those synaptic connections that would support his thoughts and behavior. And through repeated choice of the good, Christ too formed a nervous system oriented to the glory of his Father. As St. Teresa of Avila insists, the surest path to God is meditation on Christ's humanity. And I think that neuroscience can help us to see the scandalous love, the madness, as St. Catherine of Siena would tell us, of the love of the Father who chose to send his Son in the likeness of our human flesh. So the potential fruits of neuroscience for Christians are great. They include a richer self-awareness as embodied creatures, assistance on our path of conversion, of charity, and of intimacy with God, and a deeper wonder at the mysteries of our faith. These are great fruits. The task of the church before this possibility, the task of all of us who belong to the church in the modern world, is simple. It's to embrace these fruits with the radical openness of the Virgin Mary, in imitation of her fiat. We need not fear neuroscience simply because it has been weaponized in the past, simply because it has been misunderstood. Instead, just as Mary said yes to the Word becoming flesh, we are called to welcome the truths revealed through the study of the brain and to put them in the service of truth incarnate. Our contemporaries are longing to know that materialism is a lie. Our peers, our students, our neighbors, our children are longing to discover that the truth is one, to find the great joy that comes from seeing that the world is charged with the grandeur of God, as Gerard Manley Hopkins wrote. The church can be the place where this discovery happens. The church is the place where this discovery happens. Let us be such a place. For the poor are in need of it. They're in need of a home where reality is revealed to be one, where their lives are revealed to be dignified and whole. Those who need liberation from materialism are poor, perhaps the least of our brothers and sisters. Because as St. Teresa of Calcutta would remind us, the greatest poverty is not simply material, but spiritual. Our brothers and sisters are told in their suffering that they are nothing more than a set of meaningless biological processes. Here, we, as the church, have the opportunity, the task, the responsibility to set them free from the lie that science proves materialism to be true. We are responsible for correcting the false claim that neuroscience competes with the faith, that neuroscience reveals the self to be a mere illusion. We are responsible for proclaiming the hope that we have to bring, our hope in Jesus Christ, God become man for our salvation. So bearing witness to the integral harmony that exists between our faith and the best of modern science, the church can help a fragmented culture to rediscover the grandeur of human life, the joy of living as a yes to our Creator. So in summary today, we've discussed how this false conflict narrative emerged in history. We've gone back to the origin to understand what neuroscience is in its essence. We've seen how studying the brain can reveal aspects and realities that are eminently compatible and harmonious with the Christian view of the person. And we've understood how some of these insights can help us in our work of personal conversion and faith, and our work to share this joy with those around us. Tomorrow, as I mentioned, we will deepen this discussion by considering the role of relationships in embodied human life as a privileged place where our freedom is called forth in the service of God's plan. Thank you for joining us today, and I'm happy to now take any questions.
Well, Dr. Carozza, I don't think I've seen so many mind-blown emojis in a seminar before, so certainly a lot of brain emojis popping up. And just a reminder, if you haven't had a chance to type in your questions, there's still time. We've had a number of questions come in, but we'll make sure to get through as many as we can today. Maybe to just kind of start big picture, can you help us to understand, in particular, the insights that our Catholic faith brings to bear on the way that we look at reality? In other words, how does faith kind of shape the way we reason? And then how does our reason shape the way we believe? And I guess what I'm driving at is that quote from Pope St. John Paul II, right? Mm-hmm. Faith and reason are the two wings upon which the human spirit rises to contemplation of God. So how you've laid out a really beautiful, I think, picture for us, but how do these two aspects of our human knowing kind of cohere together, and how might we approach that as Catholics?
Yeah, an essential question, one that I think touches every scientific discipline. And the beauty of this question is that it's a path of continual discovery. We're never going to arrive at a point where we know everything that our faith has to tell science and everything that science has to tell our faith. If we were at that point, I would suggest every scientist should quit their job. But we have more to discover. I think, taking inspiration from that beautiful line from St. John Paul the Great, I would say that faith can help, let me start the other place. Science can help faith be purified from error and superstition. One example of this would have been the shift from the view of the solar system as something centered around the Earth to one centered around the sun. When this was first put forward by scientists through their insistent observation of the heavens as the most plausible theory, there was initially great pushback from men and women of faith, because until that point, we had considered as an integral aspect of our understanding of the created world to be this primacy of the human person at the center of creation, as manifest in a particular arrangement of the solar system and the universe. But science, through helping us come to the realization that solar system is arranged differently, purified us of the error that this particular or physical arrangement was essential to the expression of the truth that the human person is the pinnacle of creation. Note that it does not disprove that the human person is the pinnacle of creation, but invited us to discover that in a different way. Indeed, I would argue the vastness of the universe and the seeming pointlessness of so many galaxies and stars and systems out there points in a more dramatic way to our primacy, that all of this was created for you. And I think that's one very beautiful gift to our faith that science has given, purifying us of a certain form of superstition or false ideas and inviting us to a deeper act of faith through the interpretation of what God has made. But so too does faith chasten and order and purify science. As I said, science is not something that is just a material act. It's continually bound up with human experience and with theories and ideas that are drawn from other disciplines, especially from philosophy, and in neuroscience, also psychology. And I think that we can neglect this reality as scientists quite easily. But when a scientist is a person of faith, through the daily practice of that faith and through the relationships that we have in the church, we're continually put in front of the fact that science is not ultimately the final and exhaustive explanation of reality, and nor is it something that will eventually give us full control over ourselves and over the material world. Instead, it's a subsidiary or secondary discipline that feeds off of, is nourished by, and dependent upon these higher realities. And so in the life of any given scientist, this very practically changes how you go about your work. You are chastened by the vastness of knowledge, how little you know, and continually invited to use your work as service, as discovery for the sake of wonder, and praise of the one who is actually in control. And I think that many of the more alarming scientific results of the past 20th century, the atomic bomb, to name one, would have been very different if primarily conducted within the context of a scientific discipline that understood itself to be dependent upon and serving a reality of faith.
Thank you for that. We have a number of questions kind of circling around this idea of the language that we use to describe ourselves, kind of offhand, being wired for God or coming preloaded with certain kind of software. Mm-hmm. To what extent is this language helpful or not helpful, especially if we understand the human person as imago Dei, created in the image and likeness of God? So could you help shed some insight on that for us? Because I know I myself fall into that kind of language. I know it comes up frequently in conversation, and it seems like to some extent there's a value because there's an analogy being drawn there. But I would imagine that the disanalogous nature would be much greater than any analogy we can draw. So how helpful or not helpful is that kind of language?
I'm glad this question is coming up because it's a question that I have as well. In translating neuroscience findings, it can be very difficult to not use this language, including the computational metaphor for the human brain, which in my view is probably the more problematic of these forms of language that we can use. The idea that the brain is a computer, especially in this time of AI, I think that context really matters for the use of this language. Being more cognizant of when we use it can become an invitation to be more self-reflective about our self-understanding. So I would never say, don't use the phrase wired for. In a particular context, when speaking with someone who shares an understanding of our biology that is heavily reliant upon materialism, the use of a phrase like the fact that we're wired for God is both true and helpful, because we do inherit a certain kind of nature that is also biological and also ordered toward the spiritual in this way. But in another context, for example, when raising one's children and talking to those children about the mental suffering that they may be experienced, that's one place where I would say we have a responsibility to be very careful with the language that we use, because the connotations that language carries can end up reifying within that person's own experience of themselves a certain interpretation of their reality that can lead them away from the truth. I encounter many people, I encountered them especially during my PhD, who have experienced, for example, trauma and adversity early in life. And I found that many of these people were initially helped by the discovery that this can change your brain architecture, helped to not blame themselves for certain reactions, helped to not be ashamed of the fact that, for example, they had difficulty trusting others in relationship. But ultimately, this could only carry them so far, because there was also the temptation to say, well, then everything that I am now as someone who's been exposed to trauma is determined, is set in stone in my biology. I am wired this way and there is no way to change. And so here, I think that's another example of a place to be very attentive with our language. We can certainly invoke neuroplasticity and say, no, there's still a biological way in which you can change. But ultimately, to use language that reflects our commitment to the truth that ultimately grace is operative and God is not bound by his creation. And so we are not able to put limits on what he can do, even with our nervous systems. And I think this is a discovery and a realization that can bring great hope to those who feel constrained by their biology, their nervous systems. So I suppose there's no simple answer. There's no recipe or algorithm. I would simply invite greater attention to the language that one uses and the language that one hears in culture. Acceptance of the times when this is appropriate, and indeed using it when it can be helpful to others. But especially in cases where vulnerable persons, such as children or those with mental illness, may be involved, to always be sure to use metaphors and phrases insofar as we can that encourage in them the hope in a vision of the person that is free and responsible and spiritual as well as physical.
Thank you. Thank you for that. So some questions around the master and his emissary. So Ian McGilchrist writes a famous book, and the basic thesis is that there's the two hemispheres and experience reality in complementary sorts of ways. So I guess the question is, to what extent do you agree or disagree with McGilchrist's thesis of this idea that each of the hemispheres experiences reality in different sorts of ways? And then if you do accept that, are there any insights to be drawn in terms of the way that we experience the world religiously, in a sense? And is there a tendency to emphasize, the left hemisphere over the right? So any thoughts on that?
Yes, I do. This is actually maybe not number one, but 2 or 3 in the questions that I get from non-scientists who are or non-neuroscientists who are very curious about his work. I think a testament to the influence that it is having and the stature of his work. I would start by saying that I find some aspects of his work very helpful. I think he traces a cultural critique of Western modernity that holds a lot of water and can help us be more self-reflective and aware about certain biases that we have, and ultimately to move culture into a positive direction. I would also say, however, that he tends to use neuroscience somewhat inconsistently in his work. Sometimes he invokes it as a metaphor or as an analogy, and in that use, I have no problem with it. In others, he will, through imprecision of language and some misleading statements, make it seem like the brain is the causal or driving factor in cultural changes that we've seen across the past centuries. And I would very strongly object to this thesis. I don't think that the left versus right brain shift is the primary or even an adequate explanatory key. I think it's a helpful metaphor in some ways. I don't think it's a helpful explanation. And these are two very different things. I would also draw attention to, in the question you asked, is there some validity to the idea that left and right hemispheres experience reality differently? And in answering this question, I would point the listener back to something I mentioned in my talk about the mereological fallacy, which is the ascription of some capacity or experience of the whole to a part. In this case, experiencing reality is a capacity of the whole. There's no experience of reality in the right hemisphere, experience of reality at the left, that somehow are mushed together into the experience of Sofia. Sofia experiences reality. If she has an intact brain, she does so taking up both her left and right hemispheres. Now, the processes that the left and right hemispheres have do differ. And so certain features of the environment will be picked up more by or be more salient to one hemisphere over the other. But that's not to say that there are two different minds that are somehow combined, which I think can be a misconception in this regard. Damage, because we have a hylomorphic organization of the person and we're not dualists, damage to a certain part of the brain, we'd expect that to somehow affect the soul because it is damaging one of the component parts of this hierarchical organization that mediates and enacts our experience of reality. But damage to a part that changes the whole is very different from the absence of a kind of experience that is actually taking place within that part. And I think this is a distinction that, at least in interpretations of McGilchrist's work, is not always clear.
Thank you for that. A number of questions also circulating, Dr. Carozza, around the distinction between the brain and the mind. And I think you helped help us to kind of build out some architecture to understand that. But can you help us to kind of understand how we this question, especially, you hear people say things like, if a person is experiencing depression, chemical balance, but then there's also certainly from our Catholic anthropology, we understand what happens to the body affects the soul and vice versa. So how do we think through these phenomena that are multifactorial? How do we approach these as Catholics?
Yes. I'm glad that you brought this up, in part because I don't want my comments earlier about depression as a chemical imbalance to somehow be taken to say that there isn't a chemical imbalance in depression. I think one of the gifts that neuroscience and science in general has given us in this area is the understanding that there are also physical processes, and what those physical processes are, that can precipitate, exacerbate, or change certain forms of suffering that are also psychological and spiritual. So this is a very important starting point that I think we must always keep in mind, and that many of our brothers and sisters in the church would benefit from appreciating more. So this is already one gift that we can share. However, I also see that there can be the temptation to take this too far and to say that the bottom-up route of suffering is really the only way that we can arrive at a state like depression. It's simply an imbalance in the brain, and we need an SSRI to restore what everybody else has. This is a misconception in the first place about the person who, as we've been talking about, is irreducibly spiritual. While it may be the case for some non-human organism that a chemical imbalance is coextensive with any kind of pain or suffering they experience, insofar as we can ascribe those words to a non-human animal, then it would be appropriate. But with the human person, when we use these words, we're speaking of a reality that cannot be reduced to biology. And this needs to be present in our accompaniment of men and women experiencing mental illness. I think that it's also, so that's how it's incompatible with our philosophical view. It's also incompatible with neuroscience. In a very striking course of research over the last 20 years, the National Institute for Mental Health was initially very much all in on the idea that we could find genetic biomarkers and neural architecture patterns that are explanatory of mental illnesses, even serious mental illnesses, from schizophrenia to anxiety, you name it. And there was a huge amount of money and effort and time put into this endeavor. And the result is that, as Thomas Insel, the former director of the NIMH, has said, it was a failure, really, not because we didn't discover things about the brain. We certainly did, but we did not discover patterns that are explanatory of, there's no depression signature in the brain, right? There are some changes we tend to see in some people who are experiencing depression, but there's no biological change that we can point to and say, that's depression. It's not even a deficit of serotonin, which is our primary way of helping people biologically to alleviate their suffering. That seems to be changing a certain aspect of the brain that was not the problem there to begin with. And so the NIMH has moved toward research that helps consider people in their context, in their environment, so their food, their exercise, their social relationships, even their experience of meaning. And this is where I'll conclude on this topic. I think that in speaking of our own mental afflictions and those of others, we must always keep in mind that the human person is made for meaning. And I think a deficit of meaning, a lack of awareness of meaning, a doubt about meaning is one of the hearts of most experiences of mental illness. And I think having this at the center can be very helpful. We can then bring biological therapies and explanations on board, but as part of an integrated whole that acknowledges that the human person is made for meaning. Now, to conclude, the mind and the brain in general, this is a great mystery, and perhaps not one of the first, but one of the questions that I will ask God on the day of eternity is to explain and reveal to me exactly what the mind is and exactly what its relationship to the brain is. But insofar as I'm on this side of the veil, the explanation that I have come to through reason and conversation with people much more intelligent and well-read than myself is that the human person is an organism who consists of hierarchically organized systems. And I would put, without differentiating those systems strictly, of course, because the brain influences the mind and is influenced by the brain, and somehow those also are influenced by the spirit and the soul. So I wouldn't distinguish those, right? You can't pull an organism apart and separate the levels out. But I would say that these are different explanatory levels according to which we can approach the person. So the mind and the brain then would be different explanatory levels for approaching the mystery of the whole person.
Great, thank you. We have time for maybe 2 or 3 shorter question and answer format. So, and this is the question I'm about to ask you is not a short question format, but the last seminar that we had with Monsignor Shea, we talked about the young adult crisis of meaning.
Yeah.
And, you know, there's a movement now, and it's been going on for some time, this idea of the power of positive thinking, and meaning is something that you can somehow manifest, or you can manifest things. Why at first is it the case that we must discover meaning and not, we can't create meaning? And then 2, with this crisis of meaning that we're seeing, especially in younger generations, what are some of the insights from neuroscience that can help us to think through how we might address this particular crisis?
Yeah, it's a very important and timely question. Also, with the extraordinary increase in adult converts to the faith, many of whom are moved by an awareness of a meaning that exists outside of themselves, not of their own making. I think that the question of meaning and even this endeavor to manifest or produce some kind of meaning displays a very good element of the human person, dimension, capacity of the human person, which is the capacity to recognize and discover truth and to perceive how that truth bears a significance for oneself. This is a great and exclusively human capacity. And I think that we can, in our great distraction, our busyness, our skepticism, our loneliness, we can step back from this great pursuit of meaning and therefore not discover the promise that God gives when he gives each of us a life. So this is a great movement that I would love to affirm. I would also say, though, that exactly as you said, meaning does not come from within ourselves. We do not construct meaning. Meaning, truth, the discovery of truth, knowledge, is something that mysteriously is both subjective and objective. It is subjective because, as I said before, you can't discover truth outside of the consciousness and person of a human being. But it's also objective because that can only be discovered because there is something outside of oneself that is not of one's own making. Any attempt we may have to create meaning ultimately will fail because we do not generate reality and we do not generate truth. And it will fail too because there's a certain consistency in our fundamental human needs that demands something from outside of oneself. In other words, the insatiability of the heart will be apparent to oneself. Anyone who's gone down a journey of personal health or trying to fix your life through behavioral hacks will have found that at a certain point, the gas runs out and one ends in despair because you see that your human initiative is not enough. The human person, in the words of one of my favorite theologians, is a beggar. The beggar is the protagonist of history. We are given a certain heart in this world, including the need for meaning, and placed in reality so that we can find an answer, not by creating that answer, but through begging to discover it. And the great mystery and message of Christianity is that God, too, is a beggar. Christ came to earth as a reflection of his being as a beggar for man's heart. The incarnation is God begging for you and for me. And so it's at this encounter between my subjectivity and reality that comes to meet me that meaning in a sustainable and satisfying way can be discovered.
Thank you for that. You painted this beautiful picture at the end of the incarnational reality of our faith. And I think especially in Catholicism, this deep sense of the both and, and the fact that Christ redeemed every aspect of our human nature. I think that was really beautiful. I'm curious to know what insights neuroscience might have gleaned from our Catholic faith. And I'm thinking in particular about, our understanding of the sacraments and especially the life, the sacramental life and the life of contemplative prayer. Is there something that neuroscience can glean from our particular emphasis on the incarnational dimension of our faith?
Yes, I'm very glad that you asked this question. And I'm very convicted that neuroscience really needs our vision of the spiritual life. There is a long-standing subfield within neuroscience that seeks the neurocorrelates of spirituality and of spiritual experience. And if you look at those studies, for the most part, they examine, insofar as this is possible in a brain scanner, the practice, you could say, of imaginative prayer, seeking in the end, actually, not even that, but a kind of experience of mystical ecstasy, something of what we would imagine with, Bernini's sculpture of Saint Teresa. The neurocorrelates of that experience is what neuroscientists seem to be after mostly. And they will do so conflating studies of various kinds of spiritual traditions, including non-Christian traditions. Now, of course, any anthropologist, or let alone a theologian or a person of faith, would say that there are very significant and serious differences between these traditions. And also that the experience of quieting your mind and heart and imagining God, or endeavoring to feel yourself to be receiving his loving kindness, those can be elements of prayer, but they're certainly not constitutive of it, and they're not exhaustive. In fact, the incarnation, exactly as you pointed out, is the great overturning of this attempt to reach God through our consciousness. God says, yes, you're seeking me, and that's good, but I'm coming to you and coming to you in the flesh, so that now through your brother and sister, especially those in need, through salt and wine and bread and water, you can experience me in your body, and not simply through our mental faculties, as important and valuable as that is. And I'll speak more about prayer tomorrow. But I would say that neuroscience here has so much to discover about the spiritual life through taking seriously Catholic practices of prayer in liturgy. I would love to see neuroscientific and psychological studies proliferate around, what's happening in the human person when she prays the rosary, when she is anointed, when she is at a liturgy, praying the Liturgy of the Hours, or at the Mass with others. Obviously, this is very hard to do in a way that respects the integrity of these practices. But I think it can be done creatively. And I know some friends who are seeking to get these kinds of projects started. So hopefully in a few years, my answer to these questions will be different.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more question. So this question revolves around the monetization of harnessing neuroscience to influence our behavior.
Yes.
We've seen a lot of this, being caught in the algorithm. What can we do to resist this? I think you've helped paint a picture that we're not purely we're not purely the result of these processes, but certainly there is a sense in which we're being manipulated, or there's an attempt to manipulate us into acting in certain ways. How would, as a neuroscientist, how would you kind of work through that, and any advice that you would give?
This is a very urgent question, and I'm glad that it came up. Yes, neuroscience is very explicitly and intentionally being exploited in order to profit off of you, especially your attention and your behavior and your shopping. So this is dangerous. But I would say that knowledge of neuroscience can help us in two ways. The first is that by greater awareness of what it is that is salient to our nervous systems, like 30-second reels, bright colors, horror stories of violence, all these things that we could say wired. We are wired to find interesting on a very low level of our sensory perception. The awareness of the fact that these things are being used to exploit and shape our behavior can help us take very small steps in our days to free ourselves from this influence in simple ways, such as turning your phone on grayscale, turning off notifications, deleting TikTok, receiving your news from a reputable news source once a day and setting aside time for that and to pray through that, through cultivating agire contra, the principle of acting against a particular temptation. When you find yourself drawn to the 30-second microdose of stimulation through digital technology, to instead make an act of the will of openness to God, and in front of his infinity, his timelessness, cultivating a devotion to that each time. All of these principles can help us be in the world while guarding us from some of the effects of the world. So that's the first thing I would say. But the second is that neuroscience can help us be revolutionaries also, which is a posture that I'm particularly inclined to. And revolutionaries through building institutions that also take seriously how our nervous system is built and organized, but direct it toward an end other than efficiency, profit, and pleasure. That direct it toward the end of faith, hope, and charity, knowing, loving, and serving God. I think especially of educational institutions and churches, that greater knowledge about how we're organized and how the soul and body composite that we are exists can help us educate our children and accompany one another in the flesh in a more effective and compelling way. And I could point to any number of initiatives across, including Word on Fire and so many new schools promoting classical education and Montessori, and so many amazing initiatives that do exactly this. And I think this is a great, and I'll end here, this is a great capacity and spiritual gift of ours as Americans. And as we're approaching the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, I think this is a perfect occasion to name and claim this entrepreneurial spirit and order it toward the fullest good that it possibly can be ordered toward, which is, again, knowing, loving, and serving God. So for all of you who are involved in these kinds of works and initiatives, I say thank you and continue like this.
Well, thank you, Dr. Carozza. To be continued. And for all of those of you who are joining us on the Word on Fire Institute, we will be back here tomorrow at the same time, same place. For those of you joining on YouTube, please consider joining us at the Institute, www.institute.wordonfire.org. You can sign up, get a 30-day free trial, and get access to all of our programs. Until then, we will be back here, right here in Rochester. We will see you then. God bless you all.